Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In this video, we're exploring two stories that left me completely stunned. They're both unlike anything I've ever read before, and absolutely terrifying. As always, I hope you enjoy them, and let me know what you think. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. My name's Caleb, and this happened about 2 years ago. Although for a long time I couldn't even bring myself to say it out loud because every time I tried, it sounded insane. Like something out of a bad horror movie instead of something that actually happened to me. I live in West Virginia, and I grew up there too. But it was never an easy place for me. Not because of the mountains or the isolation, but because my childhood wasn't great, and there are parts of that state that still feel heavy to me. Like they're holding on to things I've tried to forget. About 6 years ago, when I was in a pretty bad place mentally, I bought an old RV off a neighbor who was practically giving it away. And I decided I'd rebuild it from the inside out, as a way to keep my hands busy and my head from going somewhere dark. It took me almost 2 years to get it how I wanted. And then, for the next 4 years, I traveled all over the country, staying in deserts, forests, national parks, truck stops, random patches of land I found on maps, and I got used to being alone. I got used to strange noises, to animals brushing past, and I never really felt scared, not in any real way. So when I finally headed back toward West Virginia after all that time, I told myself I'd ease into it. Stop in the Appalachian mountains for a few nights before actually going home. Just to reconnect with the land without stepping straight back into old memories. I had been parked in this one remote pull-off for 2 days already, tucked near a narrow creek that ran maybe 30 feet from where I'd set up. It had been raining on and off, the kind of steady damp weather that makes everything smell like wet leaves and earth. And I had my little setup going outside the RV with a folding chair and a small fire pit I'd built from rocks. That afternoon I was cooking dinner, just something simple, and out of nowhere I got this feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't too obvious, and I'm not the paranoid type. But it was strong enough that I stopped what I was doing and looked around, scanning the tree line slowly, listening harder than usual. I didn't see anything, and I didn't hear voices or movement, but the feeling didn't go away. And that's what bothered me, because I'd spent years alone, in places way more isolated, and I'd never felt it so clearly. It wasn't a reason to panic, but it also wasn't something I could just brush off and ignore. When you live isolated like that, you rely on yourself and your instincts to survive. And I wasn't about to be one of those idiots who ignores his gut just for the sake of pretending everything's fine. I told myself I'd pack up and leave in the morning, and I started closing things down for the night. But then I realized I didn't have enough clean water inside for the night. My filter had broken a few days earlier, so I'd been boiling creek water instead, and I knew I'd wake up thirsty like I always do. So before shutting everything down, I grabbed my container and walked the short distance to the creek. It couldn't have taken more than a couple of minutes. And I remember glancing back at the RV once or twice, just because that uneasy feeling was still there, even though nothing looked out of place. I boiled the water over the fire, and just as it started raining again, steady and cold, I took that as my cue to wrap up, kill the fire, and get inside. I locked the door shut the blinds, turned off the main lights, and lay down in the dark, telling myself first thing in the morning, I would leave that place. For a while, I just listened to the rain tapping on the roof and the occasional drip sliding down the sides. And after maybe 15 or 20 minutes of nothing unusual, I started to relax, thinking maybe someone had been hiking nearby earlier and left without me noticing. But then, lying there in the complete darkness, I heard it. It was small, almost nothing. It sounded like someone trying to stifle a sneeze. That sharp intake and forced stop. But it didn't come from outside. It came from inside the RV. I didn't move at first, because my brain was trying to come up with a reasonable explanation, like maybe something shifted in a cabinet, or the rain hit something loose. But deep down, I knew exactly what I'd heard. It was too controlled, too human. I was lying there in the dark, completely still, and I felt this wave of cold move through my chest, because the only time someone could have gotten in was when I walked to the creek, and I hadn't thought to lock the door for those few minutes. I keep a knife near my bed, not because I expect trouble, but because you never know. And I reached for it slowly, trying not to make noise. Then I turned on the small light above the bed, and almost immediately I heard something shift. It wasn't loud, but in that tight space it was unmistakable. My mind went through the layout fast. The bathroom was clear because I'd used it right before lying down. That left two places. Under the bed where I store tools and gear, and a narrow cabinet where I used to have a small washer installed before it broke and I removed it. That cabinet space was tight, which is why I checked under the bed first, dropping down, yanking the storage bins out, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. But there was nothing there. And then I heard it again. A faint, controlled movement from the cabinet. I stood up, walked over in what felt like slow motion but was probably only a couple of seconds, and pulled the cabinet door open as fast as I could. Nothing. Absolutely nothing could have prepared me for what I saw next. Inside was a man folded into that space in a way I still can't fully process. He was wearing a tight black suit, like some kind of full-body athletic outfit, and he was bent in on himself, knees tucked high, shoulders twisted unnaturally, like a contortionist fitting into a box too small for him. The fabric was so tight I could see the outline of his body clearly, which is how I knew he wasn't holding a weapon. His face was uncovered, and all I could see clearly were his eyes and his mouth. He was smiling, not nervous, not scared that I had caught him, just smiling in this wide, fixed way that completely matched the sheer bizarreness of the situation. For a second, I think I just froze, because it was so far from anything I expected that my brain lagged behind reality. And then something snapped, and I grabbed him by the arm and yanked him out of the cabinet. I don't even remember exactly what I yelled, just that I was furious and terrified at the same time, telling him to get out, to get the hell out right now. He didn't fight back. He didn't swing at me. He didn't say a word. He just kept that smile on his face as I dragged him to the door. I shoved it open, pushed him down the steps, and he stumbled but didn't fall, then turned and looked at me again with that same expression. I slammed the door, locked it, jumped into the driver's seat, and started the engine with shaking hands. I drove fast, way faster than I should have on those narrow mountain roads. And I didn't stop until I was about 2 miles away, where I finally pulled over because my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the wheel. Sitting there in the dark, rain still falling, I tried to understand what had just happened, but I couldn't make it make sense. I didn't know what his goal was, Whether he planned to wait until I was fully asleep and attack me with his bare hands, or whether he was just some kind of sick voyeur who wanted to watch me sleep. And honestly, I would have preferred a clear, violent intention over that silence and that smile. The worst part is not knowing. Not knowing why he was there, how long he'd been inside before I heard him, or what would have happened if I hadn't turned on that light when I did. I never reported it, and I know that sounds wrong, but I didn't have a name. I didn't have a clear description beyond something that already sounded unbelievable. And I just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. I drove straight out of the mountains the next morning and didn't stop until I crossed state lines. Since then, small enclosed spaces without a clear purpose make my chest tighten in a way I can't explain. If I open a storage compartment or a closet and it's deeper than I expect, I get this flash of that cabinet and that twisted shape inside. I can't watch contortionist acts anymore without feeling physically sick, because all I see is that man folded into that impossible space, smiling at me like we were sharing some kind of private joke. I've spent 2 years trying to figure out what I could have done differently, whether I missed something obvious, whether I should have seen him earlier, and I still don't have answers. What I do know is that I was lucky, because whatever he intended, he didn't follow through. This is the first time I've told the full story, and even now it sounds strange coming out. But I've replayed it enough times in my head to know it was real. And the thing that still gets me, more than the fear, more than the anger, is that smile. Because it wasn't rushed or panicked. It was patient. Like he had all the time in the world and I was the one who interrupted something I was never meant to see. So this happened about 5 years ago, and I don't usually tell it. Because every time I do, I can see people trying to come up with explanations while I'm still talking. And I get it. I do the same thing when I hear stuff like this. But the truth is, I've already run through every logical scenario in my head and none of them sit right. The only reason I'm telling this now is because I recently started reading a horror short story collection. And even though one of the stories was pretty different from what happened to me, there were a few similarities, and it brought everything back to the surface. So I guess I feel like it's finally time to share what happened to me. I grew up around the Appalachians. Not deep wilderness, but close enough that the mountains were always there in the background of everything. And I've spent most of my life hiking, camping, fishing, just being out there whenever I needed to clear my head. So this wasn't some reckless trip. It wasn't me going in unprepared or trying to prove something. It was just a long weekend where I figured I'd drive out toward a quieter stretch near the West Virginia side, park off one of the old Forest Service roads, and spend a couple nights alone, like I'd done dozens of times before. I feel like I need to say this because a lot of people think things only happen to the naive, or the unprepared. That's just not true. I was prepared, and I knew those mountains pretty well. The spot I picked wasn't particularly cinematic. It was actually kind of plain. A shallow clearing surrounded by tall hardwoods and rhododendron thickets, with a narrow trail that looked like it hadn't been properly maintained in years. No big views, no cliffs, no rushing river nearby. Just woods that felt thick and old. I liked that about it because it meant fewer people. I set up in the late afternoon, cooked something simple. And by the time the light started fading, the whole place had that heavy, quiet feeling that the mountains get right before full dark, where even the insects seem to pause for a second. It's actually a really beautiful time to be out there, kind of in communion with nature. Now here's the part that still messes with me. And it didn't start with a noise or a shadow or anything obvious. It started with the ground. At some point, after I had already fallen asleep, I woke up because I felt something move. Not shaking exactly, not like an earthquake, but a slow, subtle shift under me, like when you're on a boat and someone steps onto the dock and the weight transfers. At first, I thought I was dreaming because it was so faint, and I just lay there in my sleeping bag trying to decide if I'd imagined it. Then it happened again, and this time, it was strong enough that I could hear the faint rattle of something in my pack. I wasn't panicked yet, just confused, because there was no wind and no storm, and I was on solid ground, not near any slope or loose rock. I rubbed my eyes hard and even pinched my arm just to make absolutely sure I wasn't still dreaming. Then I unzipped the tent and shined my headlamp around, expecting to see an animal brushing against the side, or maybe a tree limb that had fallen nearby. But everything looked completely still. The trees weren't swaying, the leaves weren't moving, and the air felt thick and damp. So I stepped out. And that's when I realized the movement started again. Very slow and very spaced out. The earth beneath my boots would suddenly dip, and then rise again, like something massive was shifting its weight underneath the surface. I mean, it literally felt like the ground had a pulse, except it wasn't fast like a heartbeat. It was deep and delayed, maybe once every 20 seconds. The clear sensation I had was that either there was some massive creature moving under the ground, like some kind of giant snake or lizard, or there was something enormous walking on the same ground as me, but farther away, and the only thing it produced were these strange waves through the earth. I know how bizarre that sounds, which is exactly why I kept pinching myself, just to be absolutely sure I wasn't dreaming. I crouched down and put my palm flat against the soil, and I could feel it, a low vibration that traveled up through my hand and into my wrist like distant machinery. Except there was no road nearby, no mining operations, no trains, nothing for miles that I knew of. I even turned off my headlamp and just stood there in the dark, thinking maybe my senses were playing tricks on me. But the movement didn't stop. When I turned my flashlight back on, the shock was instant. I wasn't in the same place where I had set up camp anymore. Now, I was next to a small creek. I rubbed my eyes hard again, because it was absolutely impossible, and it had to be one of two things. Either I was completely drugged somehow, or I was dreaming. There was no way my entire campsite, including me, had just moved locations. The sound from the ground had stopped, and now everything was calm. The only noise around me was the water from the creek running steadily. As you can imagine, I was just as confused as I was panicked at the possibility that I had inhaled something or ingested something that made me hallucinate like that. I couldn't think clearly at all, so the only reaction I managed was to crawl back inside the tent, zip it up, curl into my sleeping bag, and wait for whatever was happening to pass. I convinced myself that by morning everything would be back to normal. It wasn't. When I woke up, I was still in the exact same spot, right beside the creek. I had no idea where I was, and I would have believed I had hallucinated the whole thing if it wasn't for my step counter and topography app. I hadn't imagined it. I was now several miles away from where I had originally pitched my tent. As you can imagine, I packed everything up as fast as I possibly could and got out of there. The thing is, at that point, I was at least 3 days walking distance from where I had originally started the hike. There was absolutely no way I could have covered all of that in just the previous day. It simply didn't add up, no matter how many times I tried to break it down in my head. I ended up having to hike out toward a nearby small town and ask the park rangers for help getting back home. When I told them what had happened, I noticed a slight exchange of glances between the two of them. It was subtle, but it was there, and I can't pretend I didn't see it. I'll be honest, I don't know what that look meant. Maybe it was just one of those looks people give each other when they silently agree they're dealing with another crazy guy who spent too long alone in the woods. Or maybe it was something else. Something closer to recognition. Like they'd heard something similar before, or worse, like they'd seen it happen to someone else. I don't know. Because the only thing they actually said to me was that I was probably dehydrated, that spending too much time out there can mess with your head, and that after a good night's sleep, everything would feel clearer in the morning. They kept it calm, professional, almost rehearsed, and I didn't feel like arguing. I didn't have the energy to defend what I knew I had experienced, especially when I wasn't even sure how to explain it in a way that didn't make me sound unstable. So I just let it go and left it at that. Ever since then, there are periods in my life when I manage not to think about what happened. And then there are other times when I become completely obsessed with it and can't sleep at night until I try, once again, to figure out what happened to me. I even went to see a psychiatrist, spent way too much money on tests just to be told that mentally I was completely stable and that nothing was wrong. I still don't have an explanation. Sometimes I almost hope I inhaled something in the air, because that would at least make sense. But the truth is, my step count didn't hallucinate. And that's the part that really scares me.